It was the year 2024, and the dust of centuries hung in the stale air of the Archbishop's crypt. Restoration workers were carefully moving the heavy sarcophagus of Cardinal José Garibi Rivera, who had died in 1972. The Guadalajara Metropolitan Cathedral was in dire need of preservation, and the crypt, the sacred resting place for the princes of the Tapatian Church, required special attention after torrential summer rains had caused severe water damage. It was then that the master stonemason Joaquin Herrera noticed something strange. Behind the niche where the sarcophagus had rested for more than 5 decades, a single stone protruded, not quite fitting with the rest. Prying it loose, he uncovered a secret compartment no larger than a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in ecclesiastical cloth now decayed by time, lay a lead box sealed with an archbishop's wax stamp. The worker's hands trembled as, following protocol, he delivered the find to the supervising parish priest. Within the box, they found a 10-page letter dated August 20th, 1986. It was written in a faltering hand and signed by Father José María Robles Hurtado, a priest who, 38 years earlier, had mysteriously vanished along with 26 of his parishioners during a night vigil for the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. The letter began with words that chilled the blood of those who first read them. I confess before Almighty God and before whoever finds these words that I have participated in the ritual sacrifice of 26 innocent souls. What followed was a detailed list of their names, ages, and the circumstances of their deaths. The document also included a map of the colonial tunnels beneath Guadalajara's historic center, marking with chilling precision the locations where the events took place. That letter, sealed with wax and blood for 38 years in the bowels of the cathedral, did not just confess the fate of 26 devout souls who had sought spiritual comfort in the house of God. It exposed how the colonial tunnels, built by Jesuits to escape persecution, had been turned into a stage for forbidden rituals, a place where faith was perverted and where those who sought salvation found only eternal damnation. If you are a devout Catholic, or if you know the secrets held within Mexico's cathedrals, this story will shake your faith to its core. What this letter reveals about a sectarian infiltration within the church is nothing short of terrifying, a secret that has been buried for decades. Guadalajara, 1986, a city of faith and shadows. The Pearl of the West was living through an era of profound contrasts. With nearly 3 million inhabitants, the city maintained a precarious balance between encroaching modernity and the colonial traditions that clung to every corner of its historic heart. It was the second most important city in Mexico, but in matters of faith, many considered it the first. The Archdiocese of Guadalajara, one of the oldest and most influential in the country, wielded a power that transcended the merely spiritual. The economic crisis that had plagued Mexico since 1982 had hit Tapatian families hard. The peso was devalued, jobs were scarce, and people sought refuge where they had always found it, in their faith. Churches were filled not only on Sundays, but every day of the week. Novenas, rosaries, and night vigils drew multitudes seeking divine solace from earthly uncertainty. The Metropolitan Cathedral, its twin towers pointing toward the Jalisco sky, was the spiritual heart of this devotion. Built over 3 centuries, it was a symbol of the ecclesiastical power that had shaped the city's identity since its founding. And beneath the cobblestone streets, legends flowed as freely as the storm waters. The colonial tunnels were an open secret, a tale passed down through generations with a mixture of fascination and fear. Originally built in the 17th century by religious orders, primarily the Jesuits, these subterranean passages connected convents, churches, and the homes of noble families. Officially, they had been sealed since the 19th century, but the rumors persisted. Hidden entrances in the cellars of old mansions, passages still usurped for smuggling. Vaults filled with ecclesiastical treasures hidden during the Cristero War. The 26 who disappeared on that fateful night of August 15th were not just anyone. Each had a story of devotion that made them special, almost predestined for what was to come. Esperanza Gutierrez, a 72-year-old widow, was an institution in her own right. For 40 years, she had prayed the rosary daily in the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament. Always in the same pew, always with the same wooden rosary that had belonged to her mother. Her 5 grown children, while respecting her devotion, secretly found it excessive. They let her go to the vigil that night without a second thought. Mamá Esperanza, they thought, is safer in the cathedral than in her own home. The Cordero sisters represented the devout youth of Guadalajara. Ana María, 19, was in her final year at the Vincentian College and had expressed her desire to take the veil. Her younger sister, Lucia, just 17, followed her everywhere like a faithful shadow. Their parents, merchants from the Libertad market, had raised them in the strictest Catholic tradition. Seeing them leave for the vigil was a source of pride. Their girls were praying in the cathedral, while other youths their age were lost in worldly frivolities. Don Ramon Delgado, at 68, had served as a volunteer sacristan for 30 years. He knew every stone, every statue, every corner of the cathedral. His wife, bedridden with a degenerative disease, waited for him that dawn as she did every night. She would wait in vain for 10 more years, until death took her, never knowing what became of her Ramon. The Catholic Action Group was the parish's pride. 4 young married couples, all under 35, committed to active evangelization. The Hernandez family had 3 small children. The Sotos were expecting their second. The Ramirezes had just adopted an orphan girl. The Lopezes were planning their church wedding. They were the future of the Tapatian church. The 3 seminarians selected for the special vigil were the promise of the local clergy. Miguel Ángel Torres, 24, excelled in his theological studies and commanded Latin like few others. Pedro Alcántara, 22, had a voice blessed for Gregorian chant. Juan Pablo Méndez, the youngest at 20, possessed a mystical spirituality his superiors saw as a sign of future sainthood. They were destined to be the future leaders of the church. The remaining 7 were the solitary souls every parish knows, each with their own story of extreme devotion. Carmen Aguirre, a 63-year-old widow, had lost her husband and 2 sons in a car accident. Since then, she spent 12 hours a day in the cathedral. The sacristans called her the Guardian. Soledad and Remedios Pacheco, spinster sisters aged 58 and 56, had dedicated their lives to parish service. Joaquin Morales, 71, a former railroad worker with no pension nor family, survived on charity and claimed to have visions. Roberto Fuentes, 65, was a former seminarian tormented by what he saw as his cowardice before God. They all shared traits that made them ideal targets: unwavering devotion, absolute obedience to ecclesiastical authority, and a willingness to follow a priest's instructions without question. They had been watched, studied, and carefully selected for months. In his letter, Father Robles confessed they had kept a detailed record on each one: their schedules, their secretly recorded confessions, their deepest fears, their most intimate hopes. Carmen Aguirre, for example, had confessed she would gladly give her life if it meant being reunited with her family in heaven. The penitent monks took note. The selection was not random. It was surgically precise. Each victim represented an archetype needed for the ritual: the grieving widow, the consecrated virgins, the penitent, the faithful servant, the perfect families, the future priests. It was a microcosm of the church itself, offered up to open a portal they believed would transform reality. The vigil of the Assumption was a gateway to horror. The afternoon of August 15th, 1986 was perfect for a religious celebration. The Guadalajara sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The Feast of the Assumption traditionally drew crowds to the cathedral. But that year, the turnout was exceptional. Over 2,000 of the faithful gathered for the 6 o'clock evening Mass. Father José María Robles Hurtado, the main celebrant, was a charismatic figure. At 45, with a doctorate from Rome, he was eloquent and refined, known for making the most complex mysteries of faith accessible. The Mass proceeded with its usual solemnity. Father Robles spoke of the Assumption, of Mary being raised body and soul into heaven. His words resonated under the Baroque vaults as incense smoke created mystical spirals in the golden evening light. At 8 o'clock, after most of the congregation had left, the special vigil began, set to last until midnight. About 500 of the most devout remained. At 10 o'clock, the moment came that would change everything. Father Robles approached the ambo, his expression solemn. He announced he had received a special revelation. "The Blessed Virgin," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "has indicated that certain chosen souls will receive an extraordinary grace tonight, but only if they participate in an intimate vigil in the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament." Then the priest began to call out names, one by one, deliberately, as if reading from an unseen list. The chosen looked at one another with a mixture of surprise and humility. To be selected by Father Robles for a special grace was an immense honor. The 26 chosen parishioners made their way to the side chapel, a gilded, intimate space. The rest continued their prayers in the main nave, some feeling a holy envy for the chosen. In the chapel, Father Robles was not alone. He was joined by 3 other priests: Father Teodoro Sanchez, a stern man in his 60s, Father Sebastián Morales, young and newly ordained, his eyes shining with a near-fanatical fervor, and a 4th priest no one recognized, introduced as Father Humberto, a visiting penitent monk from a contemplative European order. Father Humberto was unsettling. He wore a black habit unlike any they had seen, embroidered with symbols that belonged to no known order. His face, partially hidden by a deep cowl, was unnaturally pale, and his sunken eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. When he spoke, his Spanish had an indefinable accent. Not Italian, as one might expect, but something older, more ancient. At 11 o'clock, the ritual took a strange turn. The 4 priests began to recite prayers in Latin, but it was not the familiar ecclesiastical Latin. The cadence was different, the words guttural and strange, echoing with an unnerving power that had nothing to do with heaven. The words they chanted were distorted, ancient things from a time before Christ. The incense burned with a sharp medicinal scent that turned the stomach. Several of those present felt a wave of nausea, but the weight of priestly authority held them in their places. Esperanza Gutierrez clutched her rosary until the beads dug into her palms. Don Ramon, with his years of experience, noticed the symbols on the altar cloth had been altered, that the black candles had no place there, that something was deeply and profoundly wrong. It was then that Father Robles announced the descent into the crypt. But he did not speak of the familiar crypt where the bishops lay in rest. He spoke of the crypt of the primeval martyrs, a place no one had ever heard of. Behind the chapel's main altarpiece, Father Teodoro activated a hidden mechanism. A panel of centuries-old wood pivoted silently, revealing a dark opening from which a cold, damp air flowed, smelling of ages of confinement. Worn stone steps spiraled down into the bowels of the earth. Father Humberto led the procession carrying an inverted Paschal candle as black as a moonless night. The 26 chosen followed him in single file, helping one another in a darkness barely broken by the candle's faltering light. The Cordero sisters walked hand in hand, whispering Hail Marys. The seminarians helped the older women on the slippery steps. Married couples stayed close, sensing instinctively that something was amiss, yet powerless to defy their spiritual guides. What they found at the bottom was not a crypt, but the entrance to the legendary colonial tunnels, passageways 10 feet high, built from the same volcanic stone the conquistadors had used to raise the city. The walls were lined with niches where sacred images once stood, now empty like the eye sockets of the dead. For 15 minutes, the group walked through a labyrinth of corridors that forked and rejoined, following some incomprehensible logic. Their final destination was a circular chamber, some 30 feet in diameter. The vaulted ceiling was lost in the darkness above. In the center, an altar of pure black obsidian reflected the flames of torches set in wrought iron sconces. The walls were covered in symbols that blended distorted Christian iconography with pre-Hispanic glyphs and Kabbalistic signs that none of them could decipher. When the cathedral bells tolled midnight, their echo reached the subterranean chamber, muffled and faint. It was the signal. Father Humberto cast off his outer habit, revealing a scarlet tunic beneath, adorned with more blasphemous symbols. The other 3 priests did the same. Beneath their sacred vestments, they all wore red robes with golden embroidery that formed impossible geometric patterns. Symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if the human mind could not process their meaning. Father Robles, with tears in his eyes but with a will of iron, began to recite the true nature of the ritual. His voice had changed. It was no longer the warm pastoral tone they all knew, but something older, more guttural. He spoke of the Nephilim, the antediluvian giants mentioned in Genesis. According to the secret doctrine of the penitents, these beings had not been destroyed in the flood but dwelled in a parallel dimension, waiting for the moment to return. The Catholic Church, he claimed, had been created to keep the portals sealed, but the truly enlightened knew that humanity needed to be reunited with its celestial fathers. The date had been calculated with astronomical precision. It was not only the Feast of the Assumption, but on this particular night a planetary alignment occurred that would not be repeated for 666 years. Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars formed a perfect triangle in the constellation of Virgo. The ancient Gnostic texts, which the penitents had guarded since the 2nd century, indicated that this configuration weakened the veil between dimensions. The 26 present had been chosen for their purity, but not purity as Christianity understands it. For the penitents, purity was the ability to generate what they called pneumatic energy, a spiritual force that emanated from genuine faith. Each victim had been measured, evaluated for months. Their confessions had not only been heard but analyzed with methods that mixed mysticism and pseudoscience. Carmen Aguirre, for example, generated energy spikes when she spoke of reuniting with her dead loved ones. The Cordero sisters radiated what the penitents called a virginal light, especially potent for their youth and devotion. The horror on the faces of the faithful was indescribable. Soledad Pacheco was the first to try to flee, but when she ran to where she remembered the entrance, she found only a solid wall. Panic seized the group. Some fell to their knees praying, others beat against the walls, while some simply stood paralyzed by terror. Don Ramon, with the courage of a man who has nothing left to lose, tried to confront the priests with a crucifix he always carried. Father Teodoro not only snatched it from him, but snapped it in two with superhuman strength, as if the wood were paper. The seminarians, trained in the rites of the church, recognized the gravity of the situation. They began to recite the Roman rite of exorcism, but their Latin words were drowned out by chants in tongues that predated Babel. The four officiants chanted in Sumerian, in Akkadian, languages that no living person should know. The sound was physically painful, like needles in the eardrums, and several of the congregants began to bleed from their ears. The dawn of August 16, 1986, brought a deceptive calm to the Guadalajara Cathedral. When the official vigil ended at midnight, the faithful who had remained in the main nave began to disperse. Some relatives of the 26 chosen waited in the atrium, puzzled that their loved ones had not emerged from the chapel of the Blessed Sacrament. By 1 in the morning, concern had turned to alarm. The husbands of the women from the Catholic Action Group went inside to look for their spouses. The chapel was empty save for the still burning candles and the faint, strange scent of incense. The sextons on duty, their expressions carefully neutral, claimed to have seen the group leave through a side door after receiving a special blessing. Father Robles, who emerged from the sacristy pale and sweating, confirmed this story. "The blessed ones," he said, his voice trembling in a way everyone attributed to spiritual emotion, "departed in such a profound state of grace that they surely decided to continue their vigil in private." The first 48 hours were crucial in establishing the official narrative. While the families wavered between worry and faith in a divine explanation, the ecclesiastical authorities moved their pieces with surgical precision. The Archbishop, Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, who himself would be assassinated under equally murky circumstances in 1993, convened an emergency meeting with his closest counsel. The version that emerged from those closed-door meetings was masterful in its simplicity. The 26 faithful, touched by a special grace during the vigil, had experienced a collective mystical event. It was not unusual, the prelates argued, for extremely devout groups of Catholics to decide to withdraw from the world. They cited historical cases of hermits and mystics who abandoned everything to seek God in the wilderness. The Guadalajara police, an institution where the Archbishop's word carried more weight than the governor's, accepted this explanation without question. The commander-in-charge, Aurelio Mendoza, a devout Catholic himself, filed the case away after a superficial investigation lasting barely a week. The tunnels were not searched. The witnesses were not thoroughly questioned. The absence of the missing person's belongings or documents was ignored. On August 20th, 5 days after the disappearance, another event occurred that sealed the case's fate. Father José María Robles Hurtado failed to appear for the 6 o'clock morning mass. His assistant found his room in the adjoining convent empty, the bed neatly made. There were no signs of a struggle, but his personal effects were gone. On the desk lay a brief handwritten letter. It read, "The weight of my sin is unbearable. I have failed God and my flock. I seek penance in the northern desert. Do not look for me. May God forgive the unforgivable." But that was not the only letter Father Robles wrote that morning. The true confession, 10 pages of detailed horror, he had hidden in the one place he knew it would eventually be found, but not immediately: the Archbishop's crypt. He knew that someday, during restoration work, or perhaps when remains were moved to make space, his testimony would see the light of day. An institutional silence fell over the case like a tombstone. The other 3 priests involved were transferred with a speed that would have raised suspicion under any other circumstances. Father Teodoro Sanchez was ordered to a mission in the Belgian Congo, where malaria would claim him in 1988. Father Sebastian Morales was sent to an indigenous parish in the highlands of Chiapas, vanishing without a trace during the Zapatista uprising of 1994, though his disappearance occurred years before the armed conflict. As for Father Humberto, No record of him remained. Officially, he never existed. The families who insisted on searching faced a subtle but effective machinery of deterrence. When Esperanza Gutierrez's eldest daughter tried to hire a private detective, she received a visit from her local parish priest reminding her that to doubt the church was a mortal sin. When the husband of one of the missing women threatened to go to the press, his grocery business began to have problems with municipal permits. The message was clear. Faith required obedience and silence. The children orphaned by the disappearance were taken in by Catholic institutions, where they were taught that their parents had been called to a higher mission. The story of their disappearance mutated, as all unsolved tragedies do, into urban legend. Night shift taxi drivers swore that in the early hours of August 15th, you could hear Gregorian chants rising from the sewers near the cathedral. Night watchmen in the historic center had their own stories. One guard documented strange lights moving on abandoned floors connected to the colonial basements. The sounds of dragging chains, and once in 1993, 26 shadows in perfect procession, crossing the inner courtyard at the stroke of midnight. His report was filed as hallucination due to fatigue. An old woman named Doña Esperanza, who sold candles in the cathedral atrium, became the case's unofficial chronicler. She claimed the Cordero sisters appeared to her every year on the anniversary, asking where the confessional was. Always the same words. "Señora, where is the father? We need to confess what we saw." In 1994, during an expansion of the main sewer line, a crew found a fork in the tunnel not marked on any map. Exploring it, they discovered the remains of black candles, pages of burnt missals, and most disturbingly, 26 rosaries embedded in a concrete wall, as if placed there while the cement was still wet. The section was immediately sealed by a higher authority. In 1996, on the 10th anniversary, the now adult children of some of the disappeared formed the Committee for the Memory of the 26. Miguel Hernandez, Jr., an engineer, applied scientific methodology to the investigation. He hired speleologists, historians, and even an ex-priest who had left the ministry after seeing things he was not meant to see. This ex-priest, identified only as Father X, revealed that rumors circulated within the clergy about the Brothers of the Shadow, another name for the penitents. According to him, every major diocese housed at least one member, their identities concealed behind a veil of subtle signals. A distinct motion of the hand when making the sign of the cross from right to left, a mirror image of the Orthodox way, stoles embroidered with a nearly imperceptible red thread, and the custom of holding private masses on dates dictated by the lunar calendar, not the liturgical one. A team of professional speleologists during their 3-day exploration made a series of unsettling discoveries. Using sonar technology, they detected no fewer than 7 hollow chambers beneath the historic city center, voids that appeared on no official map. One of these, situated directly beneath the cathedral, possessed dimensions eerily consistent with the ritual chamber, described years later in Father Robles' letter. When they attempted to access it, they found their way barred. Someone, while they slept in their hotel, had flooded every entrance with wet concrete. The hotel's security cameras, it turned out, had suffered technical failures during those precise hours. The turn of the millennium saw a bold attempt to expose the case on a national level, an effort with consequences that reached far beyond the death of journalist Carlos Monsiváis Jr. His investigation had unearthed a disturbing pattern. Documents buried in the National Archives spoke of similar disappearances in other Mexican cathedrals. 13 people in Puebla in 1923, 19 in Morelia in 1955, 31 in Oaxaca in 1971. The pattern was always the same. Nocturnal vigils, Marian festivities, and mass disappearances explained away as spiritual retreats or spontaneous pilgrimages. The book never saw the light of day. While it was being printed, the author received a visit from a law firm representing the Archdiocese of Guadalajara. The threat of a defamation lawsuit was merely the tip of the iceberg. Monsiváis Jr. began receiving late-night calls. His sources suddenly recanted their stories. His editor, citing irreconcilable creative differences, canceled the contract. The manuscript vanished from his computer, and every backup copy was corrupted by a sophisticated virus. In December of 2002, Carlos Monsiváis Jr. died in a car accident on the Guadalajara-Colima highway. His vehicle veered off the road on a perfectly straight stretch, leaving no skid marks. The case was closed, the cause of death listed as driver fatigue. False leads would surface periodically like poisonous flowers. An alcoholic vagrant known as the Prophet roamed the historic center, rambling about a procession of red-hooded figures he'd seen carrying bodies into the sewers on the night of August 15, 86. No one believed him until he was found dead of fulminant cirrhosis, though doctors at the civil hospital murmured about symptoms inconsistent with a death from alcohol. In 2010, during the renovation of a historic mansion being converted into a boutique hotel, construction workers found a walled-up entrance to the tunnels. Before they could explore it, a stop work order was issued. When work resumed 2 weeks later, the entrance had been sealed with reinforced concrete and a steel plate. The project's lead architect resigned without explanation and moved to Canada. 38 years of ecclesiastical silence, shattered by a confession from beyond the grave. The letter changes everything. Father Robles' letter, a confession of horror. The letter, discovered in November of 2024, is a document that chills the blood, not only for what it reveals, but for the clinical precision with which it is written. Father José María Robles Hurtado, in his final hours before he vanished, documented everything with the meticulousness of a man who knows he is writing for history, or perhaps for his own impossible salvation. The opening pages detail his recruitment into the penitence of the blood during his doctoral studies in Rome between 1968 and 1971. He describes how it all began innocently enough. A professor of dogmatic theology, Monsignor Giuseppe Toretti, invited him to private gatherings to discuss ancient texts not included in the canon. At first, they seemed like legitimate academic sessions, exploring apocryphal gospels and Gnostic texts from a historical perspective. The seduction was gradual. They showed him the Gospel of Judas, not the commonly known version, but what they called the complete text, in which Judas was not the betrayer, but the most enlightened disciple, the only one to whom Christ entrusted the ultimate truth. They presented him with fragments of the Book of the Watchers, supposedly predating the Great Flood, which described how the fallen angels were not punished, but instead became humanity's true guides. Each text was accompanied by interpretations that twisted Catholic doctrine, until it was unrecognizable. The point of no return came on Easter of 1970. During a secret ceremony in the catacombs of St. Calixtus, Robles witnessed his first dark miracle. An initiate, seemingly dead for 3 days, was resurrected through rituals that blended Christian elements with pre-Christian practices. The man awoke, speaking in dead languages, prophesying events that later came to pass. For the young Mexican seminarian, raised in the faith but thirsty for genuine mystical experience, it was proof. The penitents possessed real power. The sect, he testified, had an elaborate structure. They operated in cells of 13 members, a mockery of Christ and his 12 apostles, with a regional leader called an archon, and a supreme council of 7 eons, who supposedly resided in different parts of the world. Each cell was independent, yet all followed the same ritual calendar, one based on astrological conjunctions and perverted Catholic festivities. Father Robles describes how he was first seduced intellectually. They showed him apocryphal texts, forbidden gospels, and esoteric interpretations of scripture that promised a higher knowledge. Gnosis, they told him, was Christ's true message, corrupted by the Petrine Church to control the masses. Only through specific rituals performed on astrologically significant dates could humanity ascend to its true divine state. Upon returning to Mexico in 1971, Robles was assigned to Guadalajara with a specific mission: to prepare the grand ritual, a plan that would take 15 years to come to fruition. The choice of Guadalajara was no accident. The city, built upon ancient indigenous ceremonial centers, was considered a nexus of power where dimensions intersected. The colonial tunnels, built unknowingly along lines of telluric energy, would amplify any ritual performed within them. The ritual of August 15, 1986, the inverse assumption, had been planned with surgical precision. Every detail held meaning. 26 victims, because 26 is the numerical value of the tetragrammaton, the sacred name of God in Hebrew gematria. The combined age of all the victims totaled 1,260, a period mentioned in the Book of Revelation. Even the arrangement of the bodies during the ritual followed sacred geometric patterns, which would supposedly channel energy toward a dimensional portal. His description of the ritual itself is fragmentary, as if Robles could not, or would not, recall every detail. He mentions that the 26 did not die immediately. The process lasted 3 days, from August 15th to the 18th, deep within the subterranean chambers. Each victim represented an aspect of the Virgin Mary that had to be liberated through what he calls purifying suffering. He offers no graphic details, but the implication is sickeningly clear. Robles recounts specific moments that haunted him. The Cordero sisters died in each other's arms, refusing to be separated until the very end. Don Ramon Delgado prayed the entire rosary 3 times before his voice fell silent. The seminarians attempted to perform an exorcism on their captors, convinced they were possessed. The unborn children of the pregnant women were considered double offerings, of special value to the ritual. The letter names the other perpetrators besides the 4 priests. 12 lay members of the penitents participated, all of them pillars of Guadalajara society. Judge Armando Solorzano, who would later become a magistrate. The Cardenas Villalobos brothers, entrepreneurs who owned a chain of pharmacies. Dr. Ernesto Padilla, head of psychiatry at the civil hospital. Even Police Commissioner Aurelio Mendoza, the very man who would later shelve the investigation. All these names written with the precision of a man signing posthumous death warrants. The fate of the bodies is described with horrifying pragmatism. In a chamber adjacent to the main one, the penitents had, over decades, constructed a rudimentary but effective crematorium. The bodies were incinerated on the night of August 18th. The ashes, mixed with holy water in a perversion of the baptismal rite, were transported in sealed urns to Lake Chapala. There they were scattered during an astral liberation ceremony at dawn on August 19th. Robles confesses to having kept a memento from each victim. Locks of hair, small personal items, all sealed in a silver reliquary that he buried beneath the cathedral's main altar. He gives its precise location, though he warns it has likely been moved or destroyed if any surviving penitent ever reads his confession. The final pages of the letter are a descent into madness and remorse. Robles describes recurring nightmares in which the 26 visit him each night. He hears their voices during the consecration at every Mass. He sees their faces in every host he blesses. He knows his soul is damned, that there is no possible absolution for what he has done. He considers suicide but fears meeting his victims in the afterlife, and so he decides to disappear. To perhaps attempt a life of penance, though he knows it is futile. The tunnels of death, an architecture of horror. The map included with Father Robles's letter reveals a subterranean Guadalajara few could have imagined. The colonial tunnels are not mere ancient passageways. They are a complex and deliberately maintained network connecting strategic points throughout the historic center. The cathedral is the center of a web that extends to 7 major churches, abandoned convents, and at least 15 private homes that now function as government buildings or businesses. The original construction dates back to the 17th century when the Jesuits, anticipating persecution, created escape routes. The work was led by Brother Francisco Quino, who, before becoming the famed missionary of the North, spent 3 years in Guadalajara supervising what was officially the construction of cisterns and drainage systems. In reality, he was creating a mirror city underground, a refuge for a time of persecution that never came, or at least not as expected. During the Reform War of 1858 to 1861, when new laws nationalized church property, the tunnels served to hide priceless treasures. The partial inventory Robles includes is astonishing. 16th century gold chalices, monstrances set with diamonds from New Spain, paintings by Murillo and Cabrera, entire libraries of medieval manuscripts. But the most valuable treasure was not gold, but knowledge. Texts banned by the Inquisition, confiscated grimoires, alchemical treatises, and maps of other tunnel networks in colonial cities across Mexico. The Cristero War of 1926 to 1929 marked another turning point. With Catholic worship outlawed, the tunnels became subterranean cathedrals. But it was then that the penitents of the blood seized control of specific sections. Taking advantage of the chaos, they eliminated those who knew of certain entrances and modified the passageways for their own purposes. They built the ritual chambers, installed ventilation systems, and created holding cells. All while on the surface above, Cristeros and Federales killed each other in the name of faith and law. The main ritual chamber, according to Robles's detailed map, is located directly beneath the cathedral's high altar, some 15 meters deep. But it is not just its location that makes it special. The acoustics were designed by an architect initiated into the penitence, using principles of sacred geometry. Every scream, every plea, every desperate prayer would resonate at specific frequencies that, they believed, thinned the dimensional veil. The black obsidian altar at its center is no simple sacrificial table. Robles reveals it was carved following instructions from an Aztec codex the penitents obtained from the Vatican secret archives. The obsidian itself came from the Pyramid of the Moon in Teotihuacan, clandestinely extracted during an archaeological expedition in 1847. The symbols etched upon its surface are not random. They are a complex language combining elements of Hebrew Kabbalah, Hermetic alchemy, and Nahua glyphs that supposedly describe the rituals of the priests of Tezcatlipoca. Surrounding the main chamber, the subterranean complex is even more elaborate. Robles describes a preparation room where the victims were subjected to what they called inverse purification. For hours they were forced to recite Christian prayers backward to verbally renounce their faith, whether they meant it or not, and to participate in blasphemous parodies of the sacraments. The goal was not just to break their will, but to generate what the penitents called spiritual dissonance, a state where the soul was so confused it became more permeable to the forces they sought to invoke. The ventilation system deserves special mention. It was not built all at once but perfected over decades. The ducts are camouflaged as part of the colonial drainage system, with outlets in the basements of unsuspecting buildings. The Old Mint, the Palace of Justice, even the regional museum. The crematorium, a refractory brick structure capable of reaching 1,200 degrees Celsius. had a chimney that connected to that of a 19th-century bakery which operated until 1990. The smell of baking bread masked any other aroma. Robles mentions other discoveries in the tunnels that suggest the 26 from 1986 were not the first victims. He describes ossuaries containing hundreds of bones, some clearly ancient, others more recent. Niches in the walls hold partially mummified remains, some still in clothing dating back to the 19th century. In a side chamber, they found ledgers, macabre counting books where generations of penitents had documented their offerings, dating all the way back to 1847. The records are chilling in their bureaucratic banality. Dates, names, when they existed, the type of ritual performed, the results obtained. Most victims prior to 1986 were marginalized: prostitutes, beggars, orphans, indigenous people without family. They were people who would not be missed, whose disappearances would trigger no investigations. The 26th of 1986 represented an escalation, a grand ritual requiring victims of greater spiritual purity. Colonial tunnels converted into ritual slaughterhouses beneath our most sacred churches. How many more secrets do they hide? Epilogue: The Buried Truth. The letter from Father José María Robles Hurtado was delivered to civil and ecclesiastical authorities in November of 2024. The official reaction was immediate and predictable. The Archdiocese of Guadalajara issued a statement of barely 3 paragraphs, calling the document deeply disturbing and promising an exhaustive investigation with full transparency. Within hours, however, the document was classified as evidence under canonical and civil investigation and removed from public access. Copies circulating on social media were deleted by court order, citing the risk of disturbing public order and damaging the faith of believers. The Jalisco State Prosecutor's Office, now under international media pressure, ordered a preliminary exploration of the tunnels mentioned on the map. The operation, carried out in December 2024, involved 50 Special Forces officers, forensic archaeologists, and experts in colonial structures. The teams descended through the known entrances in the government palace, the regional museum, and the cathedral itself. What they found was equal parts frustrating and suspicious. Every access point to the areas described by Robles had been sealed with ultra-high-strength concrete, the kind used in military bunkers. Analysis determined the sealing had occurred in at least 3 phases, the first around 1990, the second near 2000, and the most recent in 2018. Each layer of concrete was more sophisticated than the last, suggesting considerable resources and access to advanced construction technology. To break these seals, structural engineers argued, would require controlled explosives that would compromise the stability not only of the cathedral, but of entire blocks of the historic city center. The 8 surviving families of the disappeared received the news with a mixture of relief, renewed pain, and contained rage. After 38 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers, though they were more horrific than anything they had ever imagined. María Elena Gutiérrez, Esperanza's daughter, now a 67-year-old woman with her own Catholic faith in question, told the international press, "My mother died for her faith, but not as a martyr, as a victim. For 38 years I carried the doubt of whether she had abandoned us for God. Now I know that God abandoned her, or at least his supposed representatives on earth did. How can you keep believing when the shepherds are the wolves?" The descendants of the Cordero sisters, now scattered across the United States and Canada, where they had emigrated to forget, returned to Guadalajara for an impromptu memorial service. They gathered in front of the cathedral, not inside it, and placed photographs of Ana Maria and Lucia, the young women who dreamed of being nuns and ended up as sacrifices. Their nephew, born after their disappearance and named Juan Pablo in honor of the Pope, publicly renounced his Catholic faith during the memorial, tearing the crucifix from his neck, the same one he had worn since his first communion. The new Archbishop of Guadalajara, Cardinal Francisco Robles Ortega, who repeatedly clarified he was no relation to Father José María Robles Hurtado, officiated a mass of reparation on December 20th, 2024. The cathedral, with a capacity for 3,000, held barely 500 attendees. The atmosphere was one of palpable tension, with more journalists present than faithful. In his homily, the cardinal spoke of stray sheep within the flock, of weeds among the wheat, of the need to purify the house of God without destroying the foundations of faith. He promised total transparency, but when a journalist asked if they would open the archdiocese's secret archives, the response was that certain historical documents require appropriate contextualization by experts. The names mentioned in the letter as lay accomplices set off a social earthquake among the city's elite. Although most of the accused had died, their descendants now controlled business empires, law firms, and private clinics. The Cardenas Villalobos families issued a joint statement categorically denying any connection their patriarchs had with cults or illegal activities, and threatening to sue for defamation anyone who repeated the slanders. Quietly, however, they sold their properties in the historic center, and several family members abruptly emigrated to Spain. The search for the reliquary that Father Robles had allegedly buried beneath the main altar became a media circus. For 3 nights in January 2025, an international team of forensic archaeologists used ground-penetrating technology to scan the subsoil of the cathedral. The georadar images showed multiple anomalies: metallic objects, cavities, even what appeared to be more sealed tunnels. But when the time came to excavate, the National Institute of Anthropology and History revoked the permit, arguing that the main altar is an artistic heritage of humanity, and any intervention would require years of prior studies. The penitents of the blood, if they still exist as an active organization, remain in absolute shadow. There have been no arrests, no investigations leading to current members. Officially, the Attorney General's office considers the sect a historical criminal organization, likely disbanded, but rumors persist with renewed force. Priests in rural parishes report nocturnal visitors requesting masses in ancient Latin. Strange symbols painted with animal blood appear on remote chapels, always erased before dawn. Videos of supposed black masses in cathedrals circulate on social media, though all are dismissed as hoaxes. The impact on Guadalajara's Catholic faithful has been devastating. Mass attendance dropped by 40% in the months following the letter's discovery. Seminaries reported a mass desertion of students. Parish collections barely cover basic expenses. But beyond the statistics, the damage to faith itself is immeasurable. Generations who found solace in the church now look with suspicion at every cassock, every invitation to an evening activity, every closed door in their temples. The Cathedral of Guadalajara remains open, but it is no longer the same. Tourists take selfies, unaware they are standing on sealed chambers of horror. Couples are married before the same altar beneath which 26 people begged for a mercy that never came. Children are baptized with holy water, while meters below, perhaps traces of human ash still linger, mixed with water in an unforgivable blasphemy. On August 15, 2025, the first anniversary of the letter's discovery, the 8 surviving families organized a vigil. Not in the cathedral, but in the Plaza de Armas, under the open sky, where no stone roof could trap their prayers. They carried banners with the photographs of the 26 candles that the wind blew out and they relit, and a simple but impossible demand: truth and justice. At midnight, the exact moment their loved ones began their ordeal 39 years earlier. They held a minute of silence. It was broken by the cry of María Elena Gutierrez, who screamed toward the cathedral. "Mom, we know now. We know what they did to you. Forgive us for ever doubting you." The case officially remains open but without progress. Assigned investigators are rotated every 3 months, officially to maintain a fresh perspective, unofficially to prevent them from digging too deep. Case files are temporarily lost, only to reappear with pages missing. A private detective hired by the families in 2025 abandoned the case after his 7-year-old daughter was almost accidentally run over in front of her Catholic school. His wife found a note under their door. It read, "The faith of your children is worth more than the truth of the dead." The tunnels remain sealed, guarding their secrets like unmarked graves. But sometimes, during the torrential summer rains that lash Guadalajara, the water running through the sewers of the historic center carries inexplicable things. Beads from old rosaries, fragments of cloth that might be from a cassock. And occasionally, as the drainage workers swear, water that smells of incense and leaves behind. Red stains that are not rust. The sealed letter of Father José María Robles, hidden for 38 years in the archdiocesan crypt, confirmed that 26 devout parishioners did not abandon their faith or their families. They were sacrificed in forbidden rituals by a cult that had infiltrated the very heart of the church, a place where sacred colonial tunnels became Gnostic torture chambers, where devotion was their condemnation, and where their ashes, scattered in perverted holy water, await a justice that the institution meant to protect them refuses to deliver, perpetuating a silence that is, in itself, another form of sacrifice. This story shakes the very foundations of institutional faith. If you believe all churches must open their secret archives, subscribe now. Turn on all notifications. Comment to honor the victims of religious fanaticism. Share with the hashtag Truth in the Cathedrals. This is your channel for spiritual justice, because true faith does not require innocent blood. We'll see you on Friday. And remember, the darkest secrets are hidden behind the most sacred walls.